I've been digging through forums full of true scary stories, and some of these are actually terrifying. Let's read them while I play some Minecraft. So sit back and relax. Oh, and also, between each story, you'll hear this sound. That's how you'll know a new one's starting. Here is the first story. I'm 16, and I work at the local grocery store. I've had the job for about a year now. Since I'm still in high school, I don't work during the day. I usually get scheduled for 3 weekday shifts, mostly closing from 6 to 10. This past Wednesday seemed like a normal night. It was around 9, maybe 9:30, and I was just waiting for my shift to end. I was up near the front of the store, restocking cans, when I noticed a man walk in. I'm not great at guessing ages, but he looked like he was around 40. He was average height, maybe 5 feet 10 inches, and had this really pale skin, like he hadn't been outside in a long time. His clothes didn't look dirty or anything, but they felt off. Almost like they didn't fit quite right, like he had put on someone else's outfit. It was a plain gray hoodie and black jeans, but the hoodie sat too tight around the neck, and the sleeves were too short. What caught my attention was the way he moved. He looked stiff, like inhumanly stiff. He was walking as if he didn't have any joints, just kind of rigid and unnatural. His arms hung straight at his sides, barely swinging, and his feet hit the floor hard with every step. It creeped me out a little, but I ignored it and kept working. A few minutes later, I finished and my manager told me to restock some more things near the back of the store. So I grabbed the cart and headed back, and then the man appeared again. Same strange walk. He looked like he was searching for something, but had no idea what it was. When he noticed me, he walked over and asked where the soda was. His voice was haunting, cold and flat, like there was no emotion behind it. It made me feel uneasy. Up close, his face looked wrong. Not scary, just wrong. His skin was smooth in a way that didn't look natural, almost plastic. His eyes were sunken, but not in a tired way, they just looked hollow. And the weirdest part was how he blinked. It was slow, like someone acting out what blinking is supposed to look like. I told him what aisle it was in, and then he did something that really freaked me out. He repeated my exact sentence word for word, then said thank you. That might not sound super weird, but in the moment it felt off. I finished up and went back to my manager. I looked around for the guy, but I couldn't find him anywhere. He must have left. I asked my manager if she'd seen him, but she said no. I asked the cashier later, and he said she had noticed his weird walk, but he hadn't bought anything. I went home and tried to forget about it, but I had trouble sleeping. I kept thinking about his face. It was uncanny, like a copy of a real person. It just didn't feel right. It's been a few days, and I still can't get his face or the way he walked out of my head. For the past 3 years now, I have been living in the north of the Scottish Highlands. And when I say north, I mean as far north as you can possibly go. I live in a region called Caithness, in the small coastal town of Thurso, which is actually the northernmost town on the British mainland. I had always wanted to live in the Scottish Highlands, which seemed a far cry from my gloomy hometown in Yorkshire, England. However, despite the beautiful mountains, amazing wildlife, and vibrant culture the Highlands has to offer, I soon learned Caithness was far from the idyllic destination I was hoping for. When I first moved to Thurso, I immediately took to exploring the rugged coastline in my spare time. On the right-hand side of the town's river, there's an old ruin of a castle, but past that leads to a cliff trail around the eastern coastline. After a year or so of living here, and during the Christmas season, I decided I wanted to go on a long hike by myself along this cliff trail, with the intention of going further than I ever had before. And so, I got my backpack together, packed a lunch for myself, and headed out at around 6 a.m. The hike along the trail had taken me all day, and by the evening, I had walked so far that I actually discovered what I first thought was a ghost town. What I found was an abandoned port settlement, which had the creepiest looking disperse of old stone houses, as well as what looked like the ruins of an ancient round tower. As it turned out, this was actually the Castletown Heritage Center, a tourist spot. It seemed I had walked so far around the rugged terrain that I was now 10 miles outside of Thurso. On the other side of this settlement were the distant cliffs of Dunnet Bay, which compared to the cliffs I had already trekked along, were far grander. Although I could feel my legs finally begin to give way, and already anticipating a long journey back along the trail, I decided I was going to cross the bay and reach the cliffs, and then make my way back home. Considering what I would find there, this is the point in the journey where I should have stopped. By the time I was making my way around the bay, it had become very dark. I had already walked past more than half of the bay, but the cliffs didn't feel any closer. It was at this point when I decided I really needed to turn around, as at night, walking back along the cliff trail was going to be dangerous. And for the parts of the trail that led down to the base of the cliffs, I really couldn't afford for the tide to cut off my route. Making my way back, I tried retracing my own footprints along the beach. It was so dark by now that I needed to use my phone flashlight to find them. As I wandered through the darkness, with only the dim brightness of the flashlight to guide me, I came across something. Ahead of me, I could see a dark silhouette of something in the sand. It was too far away for my flashlight to reach, but it seemed to me that it was just a big rock, so I wasn't all too concerned. But for some reason, I wasn't 100% convinced either. The closer I get to it, the more I think it could possibly be something else. I was right on top of it now, and the silhouette didn't look as much like a rock as I originally thought. If anything, it looked more like a very big fish. I didn't even realize fish could get that big in and around these waters. Still unsure whether this was just a rock or a dead fish of sorts, but too afraid to shine my light on it, I decided I was going to touch it with the toe of my boot. My first thought was that I was going to feel hard rock beneath me, only to realize the darkness had played a trick on my mind. I lift up my boot and press it on the dark silhouette, but what I felt wasn't hard rock. It was flesh. My first reaction was a little bit of shock, because if this wasn't a rock like I originally thought, then it was something else, and had once been alive. Almost afraid to shine my light on whatever this was, I finally work up the courage to do it. Hoping this really is just a very big fish, I reluctantly shine my light on the dark fleshy thing. But what the light reveals is something else. It was a seal, a dead seal pup. Seal carcasses do occasionally wash up in this region, and it wasn't even the first time I saw one. But as I studied this dead seal with my flashlight, feeling my own skin crawl as I did it, I suddenly noticed something alarming. This seal pup had a chunk of flesh bitten out of it. For all I knew, this poor seal pup could have been hit by a boat, and that's what caused the wound. But the wound was round and basically a perfect bite shape. Depending on the time of year, there are orcas around these waters, which obviously hunt seals. But this bite mark was no bigger than what a fully grown seal could make. Did another seal do this? I know other animals will sometimes eat their young, but I never heard of seals doing this. But what was even worse than the idea that this pup was potentially killed by its own species, was that this little seal pup was missing its skull. Not its head, its skull. The skin was all still there, but it was empty, lying flat down against the sand. Just when I think this night can't get any creepier, I leave the seal to continue making my way back, when I come across another dark silhouette in the sand ahead. I go towards it, and what I find is another dead seal pup. But once more, this one also had an identical wound, a fatal bite mark. And just like the other one, the skull was missing. I could accept they'd either been killed by a boat, or more likely from the evidence, an attack from another animal. But how did both these seals, with the exact same wounds in the exact same place, also have both of their skulls missing? I didn't understand it. These seals hadn't been ripped apart. They only had 2 bite marks between them. Would the seal, or seals that killed them, really remove their skulls? I didn't know. I still don't. But what I do know is that both these carcasses were identical. Completely identical, which was strange. They had clearly died the same way. I more than likely knew how they died. But what happened to their skulls? As it happens, it's actually common for seal carcasses to be found headless. Apparently, if they have been tumbling around in the surf for a while, the head can detach from the body before washing ashore. The only other answer I could find was scavengers. Sometimes other animals will scavenge the body and remove the head. What other animals that was, I wasn't sure. But at least now, I had more than one explanation as to why these seal pups were missing their skulls, even if I didn't know which answer that was. Although I had now reasoned out the cause of these missing skulls, it still struck me as weird as to how these seal pups were almost identical to each other in their demise. Maybe one of them could lose their skulls, but could they really both? I suppose so. Although carcasses washing ashore is very common to this region. Growing up most of my life in Yorkshire, England, where nothing ever happens, and suddenly moving to what seemed like the edge of the world, and finding mutilated remains of animals you only ever saw in zoos. It definitely stays with you. My fiancée and I love hiking. We've had some strange moments on trails before, but nothing like what happened a few weeks ago. We went for a short hike at a state park we've been to dozens of times. Since it was just a quick trip before dinner, We didn't pack our usual things. No knives, no pepper spray. I even said, it'll be fine. We've done this one plenty of times. The first half was normal. The air was calm, the woods were quiet. Then we came around a bend and saw a woman standing off to the side, crying softly. Not loud or dramatic, just quietly, like she wasn't even aware anyone else was there. A few feet ahead of her was a man with his back turned, pushing a stroller down a rocky trail where a stroller made absolutely no sense. We kept walking, trying not to stare. About 5 minutes later, we decided to turn back because we were starving. On our way back, we saw the man again, still pushing the stroller. I glanced inside out of curiosity. It was empty. No baby, no blanket, just an empty stroller being shoved through the woods. Without thinking, I whispered to my fiancé, "There's no baby in there." I thought we were far enough away that he wouldn't hear me. We weren't. My fiancé looked over his shoulder a moment later and said quietly, "He's staring at us." I didn't look back. I didn't have to. I could feel it. Then came the sound of footsteps behind us, picking up speed. He was following us. We started walking faster. He sped up too. Every time we looked back, he was still there. Not close enough to reach us, but always visible, always watching. We passed the crying woman again, and she didn't even look up. The stroller was gone now. The man in his blue hoodie was walking quickly behind us. That's when we ran. My chest was tight, I could barely breathe, but every time I glanced back, I saw flashes of blue moving through the trees. The trail had sharp turns, and each time we rounded one, we'd lose sight of him for a second. Then there he was again. Still walking. Still following. Finally, after what felt like forever, we caught up with another group of hikers ahead. As soon as we did, he was gone. Vanished into the woods. We sprinted to the parking lot, jumped in the car, and tore out of there. The whole drive home, I kept second-guessing myself. What if there really was a baby? What if he just wanted to confront us? But deep down, I knew something was seriously wrong. I haven't gone back to that entrance since. Sometimes I hike from different parts of the park, but lately, I've noticed baby clothes scattered along the trails. Little socks, a onesie, and every time, that same cold feeling crawls up my spine. Almost a year ago, December 2024, my partner and I decided to spend a weekend in a yurt in western central Minnesota near Sandstone for her birthday. We drove up from Chicago and made our usual small-town grocery run before descending on our spot. The road to the yurt was primitive, winding, not easily located on a map and remote. As soon as we arrived, we noticed a cabin where the owners usually stayed and a couple yurts. We were alone, and the air was cold and dry. We breathed in and out, relishing the solitude away from the noise of the city. At this time, a truck pulls up in the muddy roundabout, slows down, stops for a moment, and quickly pulls away. Not the owners. Since we arrived, we'd been hearing shotguns firing in the background and shrugged it off as hunters in the area. We made ourselves at home in the yurt, cracked a couple beers, and decided to explore. We walked towards the cabin and followed a trail to the nearby frozen lake. We noticed something hanging from the trees, and as we approached, we found severed deer parts dangling in the air. Legs and torso with bloody cartilage, veins and all. We looked down and saw the deer head staring straight at us, tongue hanging from its mouth, sitting atop a woodshed looking in the direction of our yurt. My partner, a vegetarian and animal lover, looked away horrified. We looked at each other, heard more gunshots, and made some sense of it. We texted the owners. It took them a while to respond. They assured us it was their backwoods neighbors. We felt reassured, but nevertheless a bit uncomfortable, unfamiliar, and isolated. We were still the only folks on the whole property. We returned to the yurt, drank some whiskey, warmed up, and went to bed exhausted. The yurt had no lock, but folks are friendly up here. The next day we woke up, felt refreshed, and ready to have a birthday hike around the property. We made breakfast and ran out of the stocked firewood, back to the old woodshed. As I walked, I saw the deer head in the distance, pointed in my direction, awaiting my inevitable return. I grabbed the wood, making an effort not to make eyes with the ill-fatal animal, and quickly headed back. An interesting start to the day. We milled about for a bit, and I scrambled down a hillside to the edge of the frozen lake. I came upon a pile of old rusted tins, including a pop-top beer can, a Folgers coffee tin from the 1950s, and various little bottles of different colors. As a person who studied history, these were all archaeological findings to me, and I spent the better part of the afternoon unearthing these things. I tossed them up to our site, and we dusted them off and displayed them on our picnic table. We moved on and down the road to some open public lands. I brought the whiskey with me, and we took turns swigging the bottle. We literally stumbled upon an old car door, what looked like from an old pre-60s white truck, embedded in the ground. I asked my partner to take a photo of me with it, and at that point my phone died for the remainder of the weekend. All of these findings from that afternoon started to appear strange, like someone quickly packed up and left the property for good over 60 years prior. I realized perhaps I was meddling with some bad juju and moved on. That feeling lasted on the walk back to camp. Our night proceeded as usual. The wind was picking up and the cold was blowing hard. We made a hot fire that lasted until we fell fast asleep. I woke up freezing. The fire died and the potbelly stove needed to be filled and stoked back to life. But it wasn't the cold that woke me. It sounded like something was encircling us, moving in closer and closer. I woke up my partner and she asked, "Is there another guest looking for their yurt?" It had to be 3 or 4 in the morning. My phone dead, so I didn't know. Along came more noises. It sounded like a 3-gallon bucket just rolling and rolling, whirring louder and louder. This made some sense, since we had used a bucket to fill the hot tub earlier, but it was incessant and grew louder along with the footsteps. It made no sense because the clearing in the woods couldn't have been more than 15 feet wide by 30 feet long, and a bucket couldn't roll that freely. Unexplainable. We stuck a broomstick in the door handle to keep the door locked, and kept our hatchet next to the bed. My eyes were wide for what felt like forever. I must have managed to fall asleep at some point because I woke up to daylight and I never felt so relieved. I looked outside and there was the 3-gallon bucket sitting upright where we had left it. Nothing touched or moved from the night before. These were some of the creepiest woods I have encountered. There's something about that part of the country in the cold, dead of winter that makes you feel a little alone and empty, but like someone or something is always watching. I work full-time in healthcare, which is a high-stress job, and it can be quite overwhelming and physically and mentally draining. So on my days off, to de-stress and relax, I love to go on drives by the ocean by myself or with my best friend. Most of the time we would go late at night to watch the stars or the moon, or simply just to listen to the ocean. It would reset our brains, relieve stress, and the long chats and laughs we would have were so memorable and special. But then something happened a couple of days ago, and it's made me rethink doing these beloved night drives. It was a cold, dark November night. Usually I got off work at 11, but tonight I was leaving work at around 1 a.m. The perks of working in healthcare. I worked in a tiny little town about an hour west of the big city. I lived about 45 minutes away and was dreading the drive home. It was very windy out that night, and as I left work, the brown leaves swirled around me in the parking lot. I shivered, pulling my jacket tighter around me as I slid into the front seat of my car. When my coworker had came in to relieve me, she had advised me to take the old highway home, not my usual route of the new highway. "It's so windy, my car almost blew off the highway," she had said. The old highway ran almost parallel to the new highway, except it snaked through thick forests and wound along the coastline. Normally it would take me 45 minutes to get home, but taking the old highway would take me at least an hour. But I wasn't worried about time, I was just worried about making it home safe. As I drove, my headlights illuminated the thick trees lining the road. The wind would make my car sway every now and then, making me grip the wheel tighter. All I could think about was the warmth of my bed, and I sighed, turning on my Bluetooth to listen to one of my podcasts. There was no one else on the road, and a car hadn't gone by in over 20 minutes. There were no street lamps on the old highway, and it was always very dark, with thick forest on either side, little beaches and a house every now and then. About 10 minutes later, I passed through a tiny little town, if you could even call it a town. It had a grocery store, a drugstore, a couple restaurants, and an old gas station. It was a tiny little trailer with a couple of pumps that sold cheap cigarettes, closing around 8 p.m. As I drove by the gas station, I noticed the first vehicle I had seen in a while. An old truck was idling in the gravel parking lot by the gas station. This wasn't unusual as it was a fishing town, and it was starting to become lobster season. But as I drove by, I could see the outline of someone sitting in the truck. It gave me a weird sense of comfort to know I wasn't the only one awake and on the roads at this time. I kept on driving, but I could feel myself growing very tired. About 10 minutes ahead, there was a little beach that I loved, so I decided to pull over and stop for a few minutes to have a quick smoke. The cold air and the sound of the waves would probably do a better job of waking me up than my podcast would. Plus it was stormy out, so the waves would be huge, and I loved watching the ocean's magnificent waves pummel the coastline during a storm. I pulled into the gravel parking lot by the beach and parked at the very end. There was no one else there, and as I parked, I put down my window and lit my smoke. I stepped out of the car for a few moments to try and get a glimpse of the waves, but the wind was so strong it almost took my breath away. The cold air was harsh as it hit my face, but it did its job by waking me up. But that was enough for me. I shivered and got back into the car, turning the heat on high. I breathed in the cold, salty air, and finally felt myself relax. It had been a rough shift, and I was grateful to have a few days off after tonight. About halfway through my smoke, headlights swept across my car as another vehicle pulled into the parking lot. It parked about 100 yards away from me and idled for a few minutes before turning off. I was plunged into darkness again, with no sound except for the crashing waves and the wind. All of a sudden I started to get an uneasy feeling in my stomach and was unsure why. It was not uncommon for another vehicle to be here at this hour, as a lot of people would come to the beach late at night, myself included. Some would walk along the beach in the moonlight, or smoke a joint around a little fire, or young couples would come and mess around in their cars. But still, I felt uneasy. I glanced at the time. It was 1:40 a.m. Shivering to myself, I lit up another smoke and leaned back in my seat, trying to ignore the growing heaviness in my stomach. But I was enjoying the sound of the waves and was reluctant to leave just yet. "I'll leave after I finish this smoke," I said to myself. Usually the beach was lit up by the moonlight, but tonight it was so dark. The only sounds were of the waves hitting the beach and the wind whistling through my car. After a few moments, I thought I heard the sound of gravel crunching, but looked around and didn't see anything. I shrugged and rubbed my eyes, suddenly feeling tired again. I was almost done my smoke, so I put my foot on the brakes to start my car. The red light of my brakes illuminated something through my rearview mirror for just a split second. Or at least I thought I had seen something, but when I looked back again, there was nothing there. I shook my head and tossed my smoke out of the car, laughing to myself. It's all these true crime podcasts I've been listening to. They're getting to me, I thought to myself as I put the car in reverse. I glanced at my side mirror before reversing, and my heart almost dropped into my stomach. There, illuminated by the red light, was a figure crouched down, leaning against the side of my car, near the brake light. He seemed to be slowly inching closer to the driver's door. A jolt of fear ran through me, and I froze for a second. Then fight or flight kicked in, and my body chose flight. I slammed my foot on the gas, and my car reversed quickly. The figure jumped out of the way, and as I switched the gear to drive, my headlights illuminated a man in a dark sweater and jeans, running towards the other vehicle. It was the truck I had seen earlier by the gas station. My heart sank, and I felt sick to my stomach as I floored it out of the parking lot and back on the road. I was terrified. I was about 20 minutes from home, and the old highway was basically one long winding road with very few side streets, and not many options to hide, in case he followed me. My eyes kept darting to the rear view mirror, praying I wouldn't see headlights behind me. But after a few moments, there they were. My stomach dropped again, and I increased my speed. There had to be a road up ahead I could quickly turn into and hide. Luck must have been on my side because as I turned a sharp bend, the headlights disappeared from my rear view momentarily, and I could see there was a little gravel road quickly coming up on the left. I yanked the steering wheel left, barely braking, and turned, gunning it up the little road. The road was so narrow it would only fit one car, and I was relieved to see the road had many turns, which would hide me from the main road. After getting a few hundred yards down the road, I quickly shut off my lights and rolled to a park. I sat there, shaking in total darkness, praying I wouldn't see the headlights come up the road behind me. It was silent, except for my harsh breathing. My heart was pounding. I rolled down my window and listened. It was quiet, and all I could hear was the wind blowing through the trees. I couldn't stop shaking. I wasn't a religious person, but I sat there praying I wouldn't see those headlights, praying to just make it home safely to my warm bed, praying for this all to be just as nightmare. With nothing but darkness and forest surrounding me, I waited. 10 minutes went by, then 20. Nothing. The tension in my body eased, and the sinking feeling in my stomach started to fade. I gave myself another 10 minutes, took some deep breaths, and then turned on my car, keeping my lights low. I had to do almost a 10-point turn to get myself turned back around on the narrow road, but I somehow managed to, and slowly drove down the little road back to the main road. As I came to the main road, I hesitated. I could see a few kilometers in each direction, as the road snaked around the coastline, and I didn't see any vehicles on the road. I took a deep breath and turned left towards home. The whole drive back, I was tense, but I did not see that old truck again. Only 2 cars passed me, with one being a police officer and the other being a Jeep, but I made it safely home. As I pulled into my driveway and turned off my car, I made the promise to myself to never go to that beach at night again. Some people just have bad intentions, and unfortunately I was at the wrong place at the wrong time. When I was a teenager, I was home alone. I lived with my dad, and he was away often. My bed was next to the bedroom door, which opened inwards, and I used to leave the hallway light on, and my bedroom door half open for a bit of light. I was laid in bed one night about 10 p.m. with my room light off, just chilling before sleep. And you know how you get that thin line of light at the hinge edge of the door? Well, something about 3 feet tall moved past it and briefly blocked out the light as if it was coming in my room. I almost screamed. I laid there borderline panicking and not even daring to breathe, with the taste of adrenaline in my mouth, my skin crawling and goosebumps all over. I eventually dared to move and turn my light on, then look outside my room and check the house. There was nothing there. I remember it like it was yesterday. I got no sleep and watched films all night long. It really freaked me out for a long time. When I was like 6 years old, I attended the elementary school, which was located in our small town. My way to school was basically just 500 meters of main road, before turning into the street where I lived. At the time, we're talking about the late 90s here, all the parents in the town were extremely adamant on telling their kids not to trust or follow strangers. Never get into anyone's car, even if they say they know your parents and are friends. The reason where there was a murder like 3 years back in the same town. A girl, not even 6 years old, was found to live in a field. The strange thing about it is, nobody knows how exactly she was taken, which implies somebody lured her somewhere without her suspecting a thing. The case still hasn't been solved more than 20 years later. So our parents were very afraid that their kid was going to be next. Because kids can be really stupid, and you can't watch them 24/7. Now on to what almost happened to me. I was walking home from elementary school. About halfway home, at the shadiest and mostly covered by trees and bushes area, a car pulled up next to me. A blonde about 30-ish woman was the driver. She told me she could drive me home. She claimed to be going in that direction anyway. I was not suspicious and was like, "Oh no, it is not that far, I can walk." Then she started being more insistent. The alarm bells only started ringing when she said she knew my mother. They are friends, and supposedly she was asked by her to drive me home. Luckily, my parents repeatedly talked about the tricks that people use to lure you in. I started being creeped out, continued to walk, but she kept driving beside me. Now the real weird part in hindsight was her next attempt to get me into the car. She started saying that I was obviously afraid, and cool children are not afraid of such things. If you want to be cool, you should just relax. Honestly, I did not fully realize the full extent of this situation. I just felt uncomfortable and wanted to get out of this conversation. So I just started sprinting the rest of the way back to my house. Once I got home, I stayed right next to the door and kept looking out of the window for a few minutes. And guess who drove by and basically checked out the house? That creepy woman. The road was a dead-end road, and only after 3 more minutes the car came back the same way. It took years until I realized what kind of bullet I dodged there. All I was thinking was, my parents told me not to do this. I didn't know why or what that woman wanted. The drill of hearing over and over again not to believe strangers or get into their car kicked in. When I was older and started getting into true crime, I remembered this whole thing for the first time in 2 decades. Then I realized that woman was most likely sent as the trustworthy front woman to lure kids into their car and take off. Could be she was doing this for some crazed pedo or human traffickers. Moral of the story is, even if your kids are too young, like I was, to comprehend such things, the rules of not following strangers, and the fact that strangers will lie to you for evil intentions, must be drilled into your child's head like watching both ways when crossing the road. When I was 23, I rented an apartment in an old boarding house in a neighborhood just outside the sketchy downtown of a mid-sized southern U.S. city. One night, around 2 a.m., I was driving home from my boyfriend's place after we'd had a huge fight. I was teary and not paying much attention to my surroundings. At a stoplight, I pulled up alongside the only other car on the road, made brief eye contact with the driver, and gave him a quick, absent smile. I guess he took that as some sort of invitation. At the next stoplight, He stared intently into my car with a weird, blank expression. And at the next, and the next. I was seriously uneasy, but it took me a while to realize he was actually following me. I should have driven to a police station, but this was before smartphones, and I didn't know where the closest one was. Also, I was exhausted, and guess I thought I was just being paranoid and didn't want to make a fuss. Instead, I circled around out of my way, until I no longer saw his headlights behind me. It seemed like he got bored and veered off. I was beyond relieved and drove straight home, anxious to get inside and behind locked doors. I parallel parked in a tight spot between two cars on the street outside the boarding house and cut the engine. And that's when he pulled up alongside me, close enough to the driver's side door that I couldn't have opened it if I tried. I was blocked in, and now he knew where I lived. I briefly thought about climbing across and exiting by the passenger door, but I wasn't confident that I could outrun him to the house and get it unlocked before he grabbed me, if that was his intention. It was very much the vibe he was throwing off. I fumbled my phone, and while I was fishing it out from under my seat, he got out of his car, lazily walked around to the passenger side of mine, and tried the door. Finding it locked, he leaned down and stared at me with that same intent, dead-eyed expression, and started tapping at the glass. I got my phone open and yelled that I was calling the police as I dialed 911. He began banging on the window, then slamming his fist on the windshield like he was trying to break it. Then he stopped cold and just stared for a long minute more while I talked to the dispatcher, looking utterly disappointed in me. I don't clearly remember the end of the interaction. It was a long time ago, and I was terrified and trying to give information over the phone. But I remember having the impression that he was making a mental note of the house, and that he seemed entirely confident as he ambled back to his car and unhurriedly drove away. The cops came and took my statement, and didn't seem to like what I told them one bit. If they found him, though no one ever let me know. I lived there for a few more months, and didn't get a single solid night's sleep. Every time I stay at my grandma's house, I hear someone walking upstairs. It starts at one side of the room, casually walks to the other and stops. This will happen maybe twice a night. I didn't start hearing it until I was about 14, when my grandparents made me start sleeping in a different room on the first floor because they started sleeping in separate bedrooms. Regardless, both of their rooms are also on the first floor. For a little backstory, I have always been afraid of the upstairs at their house. I don't know why, but it's always freaked me out, and I refuse to ever go up there alone. I'm 23 now, still won't go up alone. There's one room specifically, though. It's a long, narrow bedroom. When you open the door, there are closets on your left and right, a bed placed roughly in the middle of the room, and a window on the far side opposite the door. I was told growing up by my grandparents that the sons of the previous owner claimed to see a gorilla come out of the closet at night, dance around the room, and go back into the closet. I thought nothing of this story until I had to start sleeping in the other room, the room located directly below the scary room upstairs. So, we all go to bed. All the lights in the house are off, and I'm still awake, lying on the bed. Then I heard it. Footsteps, starting at one end of the room upstairs. It got closer to me, passed right above me, and continued to the end of the room, where it stopped. I'm wide awake, terrified out of my mind. It was no question to me that I had heard footsteps. I knew that slow, casual pace. I was freaked out and went to my grandpa's room. I told him what I heard. He told me that the house is old and it creaks. But he turned the dining room light on for me, so I felt a little safer. I tried going back to sleep. Then it started again, this time from where it ended the first time, by the window upstairs. It walks over me again and stops when it reached the door. I thought it was over until 5 seconds later when I heard it coming down the stairs. And silence again as it reached the first floor. I was frozen in shock. Whatever it was on my floor of the house, and sadly unaffected by the dining room light. I was staring at the doorway to my room. The dining room light was shining in, and my vision began to distort. I felt dizzy with fear, so I pulled the blankets over my head and suddenly heard a scratching sound from inside my room. I knew exactly where it was coming from, my grandpa's gun case. It was a very obvious sound, scratching on the wood, long scratches down the front of the gun case door. I could even hear the door ever so slightly tapping against the frame as each scratch began. I tried to scream and I couldn't. I took a second to take a deep breath and let out a loud scream. In seconds my grandpa had made it to my room and I was relieved. Needless to say, he still didn't believe me, so I did what any normal person would do. I draped a sheet over the side of the bed and slept underneath it. I wrapped myself tight in a comforter, put on headphones, and turned my back to the door. There could be a party of ghosts in my room, and I wouldn't even know. The next morning, my grandpa told my grandma about what happened the night before. She said, "Oh, that's silly. You know, your cousin woke me up the last time she stayed here. She came in my room saying, 'I hear footsteps.' I slept under the bed for the rest of my week stay with them. I've stayed there countless times since that happened, and I hear the footsteps every time. I sleep on top of the bed now, but keep my back to the door and sleep with headphones on. I haven't heard it come down the stairs since that first night, but if it does, I don't want to know." When I was about 10 years old, I was ill and did not go to school one day. My parents both worked and couldn't get the day off, so told me just to stay in the house and don't answer the door to anyone, and the usual stranger talks, etc. I was sitting watching TV in the front room that has a big bay window that looks out onto the street, which is a main road with a row of shops across the road. I felt awkward with all the people walking past, so decided to shut the curtains slightly. And for some reason, as I did, I noticed this man in his late 40s with a beard and glasses wearing a green knitted jumper. He looked like your stereotyped child abductor. Something about him walking past just seemed strange, but not enough to play on my mind until he walked past again 10 minutes later in the same direction, as if he had just looped round the block. 10 minutes later he appeared again and stopped at the edge of the driveway for about 30 seconds looking at the window. He then proceeded to the door looking in the window as he walked by. It was an old Victorian sandstone house with big storm doors on the front that you needed a key to open, so he couldn't get in. He knocked the door a few times, but something just told me not to answer. He then came to the window banging it and saying something, but I couldn't make it out. I then noticed the realization in his face that there was a back door. My parents never locked the back door, so the dog could come in and out as he pleased. I ran through to the kitchen, and within seconds of turning the key and locking it, the handle started turning, and he started banging the door. I just curled up in a ball on the floor in fear. He started trying to open windows and eventually left about 30 minutes later. I dread to think what could have happened if I had not remembered the back door was unlocked. When I was about 13 or 14, I lived on a farm. This wasn't a regular farm that you would expect with fields full of beans and stuff. It was actually a pine tree harvestery. My house was in the middle of 550 acres of perfectly lined longleaf pines. My living room had a huge picture window. I won't go into the architecture of the house, but it was a weird custom job built by some dentist in the 30s. The window in the living room stretched nearly the entire length of the room, maybe 50 feet. The house was built on a subtle hill, so the living room itself sat 5 or 6 feet off the ground, so you had something of an angle to look out at a solid mile of pine trees. During the winter it was unsettling, because you'd get just a bit of snow, enough to reflect moonlight, so that you could see the dogs running around at night. I'll be honest, I hated that room and that window. So now to the relevant part. I had a cousin over for the weekend, and we were doing what kids do in the country, throwing stuff in the fireplace to see what happens. It is getting late, and the fire is dying down, so we build the big kingdom of couch cushions and blankets in the living room and get ready for bed. Nothing out of the ordinary until we hear the dogs barking. They were really far away. The property stretches for nearly a mile, so I just assumed they were chasing off some animal. So my cousin is staring out the window and not saying anything. He just kind of keeps staring and says he feels like he's seeing things. Naturally, I get all anxious and start staring out the window as well. Nothing happens for a few minutes, and he gets more and more annoyed with me because I'm asking what he saw. He keeps shushing me so that he can focus. And then we both see it. A shadow of a person moves from one tree to the next. Not a run, not a leap, just a brisk walk from one tree to another. This is probably 100 yards out from the house. We can't actually tell if the person is coming closer or not because we're dealing with moonlight reflecting off of snow. I guess the crazy part is that we didn't so much freak out, because at this point there is still that chance that we didn't see what we saw, you know? So we just kept staring. We should have gone to wake up my dad, but he's an idiot and the kind of guy to walk out on the patio and holler into the woods with his rifle. We were just scared enough to agree that we don't want to taunt whatever is happening. So about 3 minutes later, it happens again, but a good 50 feet from where we first saw it. Another person, another tree, a few strides, and they were gone. This happened every few minutes for the next half hour, and we just stared. At this point I should mention that I didn't really have neighbors. The land surrounding our farm was miles and miles of trees. You don't see people around the farm unless they intend to be there. So we keep watching as these two figures intermittently appear and vanish until finally we see one appear, but not disappear. Instead we focus in on it and see that it is now running forward. We instantly get up and go wake my dad. By the time we get into the room with my half-awake father, there is no one to be seen. We sprint around locking doors and windows. Keep in mind that we're out in the country with no one around. It rarely occurs to lock doors. Every door was worse than the last because you just know that as soon as you reach the door, someone is going to be trying to open it, although that never happened. We locked everything up, walked around the house at least 50 times, making sure no one got in without us knowing, and then convinced my dad to fall asleep in the living room with us while we stared out the window. I never understood why my dad wouldn't call the police. He always had this "we take care of our own" mentality, and it simply wasn't an option to call 911. The next day we went out to look and, absolutely, there were footprints everywhere in the snow. We saw them between trees, and then we finally saw where someone had been standing right in front of the window. I don't believe in the supernatural or ghosts, but this all happened, I assure you. A few years ago, me and my partner were alone in her parents' house for a fortnight, and a series of very odd things happened. One night after we'd went to bed, I woke up to use the bathroom. When I went downstairs, the cushions were strewn over the couch, and some were piled up in the corner. Knowing my partner tidies each room before bed, it immediately struck me as odd, but still needed to use the bathroom. I'd been sitting there a couple of minutes when I heard a loud knocking on the bathroom door. It's directly in front of the toilet, so I saw the door moving in the frame. 2 seconds. I explained to what I thought was my partner, but I got no reply. All I could hear on the other side was a rasping breath, loud and rhythmic. After I was finished, I sheepishly opened the door, and of course nothing was there. When I got back upstairs, my partner had heard the knocking and wondered what I was doing. I explained, and she was very creeped out. I think it was the next day we were in the living room when we heard a huge bang. It was massive, sounding like a gunshot. Immediately after, the power went off, so after I turned the power back on, we went to investigate. We found the dining room mirror had come off the wall and destroyed the power outlet below. It must have fallen vertically, but when we checked, the wire that attached the mirror was intact, and the wall fixture was also fine. Again, this isn't supernatural, but neither of us could explain it at all. Over the next few days, the dining room furniture would rearrange itself, chairs often pulling out whilst we were in the other room. We would hear the distinctive sound of someone sitting down. We'd hear people talking in other rooms, and of course they'd fall silent as you'd enter. When I was 17, my dad moved into a new house. My parents are divorced and had been living apart for some years by now. Prior to this new home, he'd been buying homes that have fallen to decay and fixing them up and selling them out for a lot more money than they'd previously been worth. Anyway, this new house was no exception. It had previously been owned by an old woman who had deceased, and her family put the house on the market. Anyway, my dad moved in the winter, and on one of his first weekends there, my 2 sisters and I stayed over. My sisters were in one room, my dad in another, and myself in my own. I had a hard time falling asleep and kept waking up on and off throughout the night. Every time I woke up, I heard what sounded like muffled voices talking in quiet conversation. It sounded a lot like a TV being played at next to nothing volume from a room next door. I assumed it was my sisters or dad with a TV on because they too couldn't sleep. I thought nothing of it and eventually fell asleep. This happened for the next few nights we stayed there, and the one morning while at breakfast I asked my family if anyone had been watching TV late at night, as I'd heard noises. My dad and sisters both said no, but both said they both also heard noises and assumed it was one of us watching TV too. The next night when my dad was home alone, he heard the noise and went to explore. No TV was turned on nor nothing to be able to make those noises. Guests of his reported the same thing, waking up in the middle of the night and hearing whispers, though thinking nothing of it. Eventually the whispers stopped and don't occur to this day. I worked as a security lieutenant for a National Guard airfield. One night, about 2 a.m., I was doing a patrol through the main drill hall and office area. I had gone through the entire building and checked every room. I was the only person in the building. As I walked out the front door, I heard, plain as day, someone go sprinting down the hallway behind me and to the right. I drew my sidearm and went running down the hall shouting at them to stop. At the end of the hallway there was a set of double doors that led out into the motor pool. They were closed and locked. No way anybody could have gotten through them without me seeing. I turned around and went back down the hallway towards the front door. weapons still drawn, and cleared every office on my way back. Every door was locked from the outside, and every office empty. I went through and re-cleared the entire building and nothing. I then walked into the main drill hall and noticed a freestanding fan was turned on. Then the room got extremely cold. That was the point I left and went back across the street to where the main airfield and my office was. I reviewed the security camera playback and nothing, just me acting crazy. But I will never forget that cold and the most unsettling and terrified feeling that I had that night. I quit 2 weeks later. Thanks if you watched the video this far. All the best to you, and see you soon.